Welcome to our part 2 of our discussion so far dito sa methods of research in psychology. So wala na tayong intro pa kasi continuation lang naman ito nung ating previous video. So let's directly go to the next method of research that you can use in doing psychological research. We have correlational method. Ang una nyong tatandaan sa correlational method is it is a statistical technique. So kapag ikaw gagamit ka ng correlational method, dapat meron ka ng knowledge on how to run a correlation analysis using a software. Pwedeng SPSS, pwede rin namang Statistica, or any other software that can run a correlation analysis. In fact, alam nyo ba, even Microsoft Excel kayang magpatakbo ng correlational analysis. Pero ano ba ang purpose ng correlation method? Why do we use this in the first place? To describe the relationship between two psychological variables. So, in this kind of research, meron kang dalawang psychological variables na gusto mong pag-aralan. At least two. Although yung mga complex na correlational method, you can have 3 or 4 or 5. The most basic level in using correlation method, meron ka lang dalawang psychological variable. Your main goal in doing a correlation between these two psychological variable is to find out kung gaano ka-close or gaano kalakas yung relationship between those two psychological variables. Basically, we would like to quantify. Sa Tagalog, gusto nating sukatin yung lakas ng relationship between those two psychological variables. Let me give you an example. Halimbawa, gusto mong i-measure yung lakas ng relationship between stress and depressive thoughts. Meron bang kinalaman or meron bang connection yung stress sa frequency o dalas ng depressive thoughts? So if that's your question, ang una mong gagawin talaga dyan or ang kailangan mong gawin dyan is to correlate the two psychological variables. And how do you do that? Basically, you need participants for this research where you are going to quantify yung kanilang stress level at yung kanilang depressive thoughts. So imagine you have 30 participants, 30. Each of those 30, magbibigay ka ng dalawang psychological test. Psychological test that can measure stress and a psychological test that can measure depressive thoughts. So, kapag nakuha mo na yung scores ng 30 na katao na yon, you are now going to correlate those scores that you got from each of those 30 people. Okay? And then from there, kapag nasukat nyo na yung relationship between those two psychological variables at the end of the process, makakakuha ka ng correlation coefficient. So yung correlation coefficient na yan yung magsasabi sa iyo kung gaano kalakas yung relationship between stress and depressive thoughts. So I will just leave this to your statistics teacher kung paano magbasa ng correlation coefficient. But just to give you a clue, this kind of correlation coefficient, positive 0.93, will tell you na malakas ang koneksyon ng stress sa depressive thoughts. So we are saying that the higher the stress of a person, the higher the depressive thoughts that person have. Or vice versa, mas mababa ang stress mo, mas mababa rin yung depressive thoughts na nangyayari sa'yo. Okay, so that's what we do in correlation. Pero alam nyo, iba pa yung basa ng correlation coefficient if you see the correlation coefficient to be negative. Ibig sabihin kasi ng negative correlation coefficient, the relationship is inverse. Inverse yung relationship between happiness and depressive thoughts. Meaning, going back to the slide, the happier you are, the lower your depressive thoughts is. And vice versa. Kapag mas mababa ang happiness mo, mas mataas naman yung depressive thoughts. Kasi nga, the correlation coefficient is showing a negative and strong relationship between those two psychological variables. Again, ipapaubaya ko na lang sa statistics teacher nyo in teaching you how to further read correlation coefficient. Now, one important knowledge na dapat alam nyo in running a correlation analysis is correlation does not establish causation. Ibig sabihin, hindi natin sinasabi, going back to that relationship between stress and depression, we are not saying that stress causes depressive thoughts or depressive thoughts cause stress. We're not saying that. All we're saying is, napansin natin na kapag tumataas yung stress, tumataas din yung depressive thoughts. Kapag bumababa yung stress, bumababa din yung depressive thoughts. But we are not saying that one causes the other. It does not establish causality. Let's move on to method number 7. Ito yung tinatawag nating cross-sectional research. In cross-sectional research, ang ginagawa natin dito is we are grouping our participants usually according to their age or to their developmental stage, and then we would like to compare a certain variable across these different ages. Gusto mong pagkumparahin yung isang psychological variables across the different age groups. Let me show you an example of a study na ginamitan ng cross-sectional research, and this is very close to my heart because this is none other than my thesis. Sa thesis ko in my masteral degree, basically I used a cross-sectional research. Ang pinag-aralan kong mga age groups dito are adolescents, age 13 to 18, young adulthood, age 21 to 35, middle adulthood, ages 45 to 55. So, yan yung mga age groups na gusto kong pagkumparahan. Now, question, ano yung mga psychological variables that I compared across these 3 ages? Basically, I compared 2 variables across these ages. Yung kanilang level of religiosity and their level of self-confidence. Basically, I would like to know kung nag-iiba-iba ba yung level of religiosity and self-confidence across these different age groups. So, yan yung ginawa ko in my masteral thesis. So, let me just give you a glimpse of the procedures na ginawa ko to answer that research question. The first step I did was to quantify the variables. I need to quantify religiosity and I need to quantify self-efficacy or self-confidence across 131 adolescents, 108 young adults, and 105 middle-agers. So from there, nung nakuha ko na yung mga scores, nung nakuha ko na yung religiosity scores and self-confidence scores nung mga age groups na yan, now that's the time that I was able to come up with a picture, okay, of how these variables are behaving across the different ages. Like for example, in terms of religiosity, I found out na walang pinagkaiba yung level of religiosity between adolescents and the young adults. Basically, they are in the average level of religiosity. But things are different by the time or when you compare the religiosity of middle adulthood. Sa middle adulthood, yung kanilang mga scores in religiosity significantly higher compared to adolescents and young adulthood. So, yan yung kinalabasan ng aking cross-sectional research. Now, let's go to my result in self-efficacy. Sa self-efficacy, surprisingly and interestingly, ganun na ganun din ang lumabas. The same pattern. Average level ang self-confidence ng mga adolescents at mga young adults, but sa mga middle-agers, yung self-efficacy nila mas mataas compared to adolescents and young adults. Exactly the same pattern that I saw from religiosity. So, ang conclusion ko sa study ko is religiosity and self-efficacy tend to increase or tend to become stronger by the time people enter middle adulthood. So, in my discussion part doon sa aking papel, piniliwanag ko kung ano kaya yung mga posibleng dahilan why people become more religious or become more self-confident by the time they enter middle adulthood years. Ano yung iba't ibang mga psychological reasons why there is an increase in religiosity and in self-efficacy during middle adulthood. Yan yung diniscuss ko doon sa discussion part ng aking masteral thesis. Now, let me just quickly introduce you to the counterpart of cross-sectional research. Hindi ko na ito kinount as one separate research method because I think it goes hand in hand with cross-sectional research. This is what we mean by longitudinal research. How is longitudinal research different from cross-sectional research? Sa longitudinal research, isang grupo lang yung pinag-aaralan natin, and this group of people, ang ginagawa natin dito is we follow them over time. In other words, as they age, we are studying them. Yan yung pinagkaiba ng longitudinal sa cross-sectional. In cross-sectional research, you are studying multiple age groups ng sabay-sabay. Meron ka ng adolescents, meron ka ng mga young adults, meron ka ng mga middle-agers. But in longitudinal research, you only have one group and you wait for this group to age. And as they age, over time, i-observe mo kung ano yung nangyayari sa psychological variable that you would like to study from them. One good example of a longitudinal research that was very popular in the field of cognitive psychology is the longitudinal study na ginawa ni Lewis Terman, where he studied the geniuses o yung mga tinatawag na mga gifted. Basically, Lewis Terman wanted to know or wanted to have a picture kung ano ba yung developmental picture ng mga taong gifted. Yung development ba nila across time kakaiba ba compared to average kids? So given that research question, gumamit ng longitudinal research si Lewis Terman. So what did he do in his research? Kumuha siya ng dalawang grupo ng mga bata, kids who are gifted and kids who are just average. He defined gifted kids as kids having an IQ of 130 and above. Mataas yan. And in his actual study, yung kanyang mga bata na nakuha ay merong average IQ of 151. So these kids are extremely gifted. In the original study, yung average kids naman, kumuha siya ng mga bata na merong IQ from 100 to 120. So from here, ang ginawa ni Lewis Terman, mga bata pa ito, no? Sinundan niya yung mga batang ito as they grow older. So yun yung longitudinal research. You are going to keep on going back to these people as they grow older just to observe kung ano yung nangyayari sa kanilang psychological variable, which in this case is their level of intelligence or their developmental pattern as they grow older. So, ang ginawa ni Lewis Terman, kinuha niya yung mga profiles ng mga gifted at ng mga average na bata. Kinuha niya lahat yan from them. Their family background, education history, their physique, so on and so forth. So, basically, marami siyang tinitignan na psychological variable sa mga batang ito as they grow older. So, what happened? After Terman got those information during the time that these people were just kids, nagpalipas siya ng oras hanggang sa yung mga batang ito ay naging teenagers na, naging adolescents na. So that happened in 1927. So anong pinagkaiba ng mga gifted sa mga average kids in terms of their development? For the gifted kids, yung kanilang scores, by the way, Lewis Terman called the gifted kids the Termanites. Kasi ito yung kanyang pinaka mga participants, no? So, pinangalanan niya ng surname niya yung mga gifted kids. So, their overall score sa isang intelligence test is on top 1% of the population. 2 out of 3 of the girls dito sa population na to, meron silang grade of A, while half of the boys obtained a grade of A, at marami sa kanila, they excelled in varied activities in school. On the other hand, yung mga average kids, yung test scores nila ay nasa gitna lamang ng population. Less than 25% of them got a grade of A, and most of them only have average skills in their interest. Ibig sabihin, they are not excelling in the activities that they are doing as compared to the gifted kids. So, ganun yung picture nila nung unang follow-up. The second follow-up was done during 1940. That was 13 years after the first follow-up when these kids were in adolescence. So, ang mga tao dito ngayon ay nasa young adulthood years na. Ano ang nakita nila? For the gifted kids, yung IQ scores nila was maintained. Nandoon pa rin sa top 1% of the population. 85% of them entered college, and this number is pretty impressive. Bakit impressive yung 85%? Kasi during that time, ang average na sa America at least, no, ang average percent ng mga tao na nakaka-enter ng college is at only 10%. So you can only imagine for this group, yung mga gifted kids, yung mga gifted teenagers, 85% of them pursued college. 38% of the undergraduates na nag-enter ng college, nagkaroon sila ng academic honors, while 45% of these gifted teenagers, they took post-college degrees. Ibig sabihin, nag-masters or nag-PhD later on in their academic career. You compare that to the average kids, this time average teenagers, only less than 10% of them entered college. Okay, so magkaiba yung picture ng development of the gifted versus the average. The third follow-up of the study was done sa noong 1952, that was 12 years after the previous follow-up. So most of these people in the study are already in the middle age years. Okay? So ano yung nakita ni Louis Terman during this time? Again, let's compare. For the gifted kids, yung mga tinatawag na Termanites, again, they maintained their IQ scores. They are still in the top 1% of the entire American population. 65% of them became professionals. Naging lawyer, physicians, engineers, teachers, businessmen, and overall, they earned $15,000 annually. And during that time, $15,000 annually is in the highest 1% of the US population. Ibig sabihin, mataas na yung sweldo na yon. For an average American, they belong to the top 1% of the American population. And not only that, nakita rin nila na yung mga gifted kids, ang dami nilang mga creative outputs. 1,000 plus journals, 60 non-fiction books, 33 novels, 375 short stories, 230 patents for those who became scientists, may isa na naging world-class columnist, may isa na naging Oscar-winning director, marami naging millionaire, marami naging real estate developers, and American judges. In fact, marami sa mga judges na ito were able to enter the American Supreme Court. Yan yung performance ng mga gifted group. You compare that to the average group, this time, yung mga nasa middle agers na average lang, less than 3% of them became professionals, and most of them, ang kanilang mga trabaho, they entered blue-collar jobs. Naging factory workers, secretaries, farmers, drivers, etc. and etc. Ibang-iba talaga yung picture ng development between the gifted and just the average. The fourth follow-up of this longitudinal study was done on 1956. That was 4 years after the previous follow-up. So marami mga tao dito ngayon are already in old age, pero ang naging problema dito, 75% of the original population was maintained. Yan yung isang problema sa longitudinal research, no? May tendency na hindi mo nakukumpleto or nawawala ng paunti-unti yung mga participants mo as the study continues for different reasons. Biglang ayaw na nila sumali, or lumipat na sila ng bahay, or kapag ganito kahaba yung study mo, yung iba talaga namamatay, no? So in this study, na-retain naman nila yung 75% of the original population. Basically, this is already good, not bad. 75% of retention is a good number for a longitudinal research. So what happened? Let's go back again to the gifted people. Marami sa kanila, they are intellectually functioning very good in old age. Maganda ang kanilang vocabulary skills. They have very low divorce rates. In other words, a lot of them are still happily married. Fewer confinements in hospitals, meaning hindi sila masyadong na-hospital. So, malakas ang kanilang pangangatawan. And most of them have high levels of satisfaction in their old age. You compare that to people who are average, baliktad na baliktad. So a lot of them already have Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive declines. Marami sa kanila are already divorced, at marami sa kanila are physically unhealthy. In fact, a lot of them, the average group, a lot of them have terminal illnesses. So given this very long longitudinal research na ginawa ni Louis Terman, by the way, to be more specific, 29 years in the making, ano yung mga natutunan natin? Ano yung mga conclusions niya? Number one, this study was able to show to us that intelligence is very stable across time periods. So usually kung ano yung average ng intellectual capacity mo during your adolescent years, hanggang sa tumanda ka, most likely nandun ka pa rin sa level na yon. Okay, so that's one of the things that the study is showing. But more importantly, number 2, the study is also showing that intelligence is one of the ways towards a good life. Diba? Kasi karamihan talaga ng mga gifted people in the longitudinal research, marami sa kanila naka-experience ng good life compared to the average group. So, isang conclusion na pwede natin gawin dito is if you want to have a good life, you need to work on your intelligence. But Louis Terman was very strict about this. He emphasized that the intelligence that he was talking about in this study include both IQ and EQ. Hindi lang puro galing sa eskwelahan, because he observed in his study na marami mga gifted people, hindi lang sila magaling lagi sa school, but they are also excelling in activities outside the school. Contrary to our picture of gifted people, di ba? Ang picture kasi natin sa kanila, mga nerd sila, no? Makakapal yung salamin, walang social life, aral lang ng aral. Hindi pala ganun yung mga gifted people. In fact, a lot of them are very well-rounded people. Marami silang alam gawin other than things inside the school. So those are the important conclusions that we learn from the longitudinal study by Louis Terman. And I think na-realize nyo na ang isang disadvantage ng paggawa ng longitudinal research is, from the word itself, it's going to be very long. Diba? Masyado siyang matagal i-complete. So, ang pakiusap ko sa inyo, huwag kayong gumawa ng study for your original research na longitudinal, because you are going to run out of time. Remember, we are in a trimestral system. Mabilis ang oras sa Lasal, kaya pumili lang kayo ng isang topic o ng isang research question na hindi na kailangan gamitan ng longitudinal research. Let's move on to method number 8. Ito yung tinatawag nating experimental research, from the root word experiment. What does it mean to experiment? Basically, ang ginagawa natin sa experiment is we are getting a group of people, and then we further divide them into at least 2 groups. Ang pinaka-basic form ng experiment is 2 groups. Okay? So, ang gagawin natin dun sa dalawang grupo is we are going to influence them differently. We are going to do something to the first group. We are going to do another thing in the second group. And we would like to find out how those things that we did to them will affect a certain behavior that we want to study. One good example of experimental research is yung research na ginawa ni Albert Bandura about the aggression of kids. Remember, Albert Bandura, in that experiment, the Bobo doll experiment, gusto niyang pag-aralan yung aggression. So gusto niyang pag-aralan kung saan ba nanggagaling yung aggression ng mga bata. And his hypothesis is, aggression is something that you learn. Okay, so anong ginawa niya para ma-confirm niya if aggression is something that you learn? Basically, ito yung naging approach ni Bandura. He got 30 kids, divided them into 2 groups. The first group of kids would watch a violent TV show, while the second group of kids will not watch a show with a violent model. So, yung unang grupo nakapanood ng show na merong violent na tao, yung pangalawang show wala siyang violent na tao. And we would like to know if exposure to those kinds of shows will affect the behavior of these kids. So ano ang nakita ni Albert Bandura according to his results? Kids imitated exactly the behaviors of the model that they saw from the television show. Especially special mention to the kids who watched a violent model. If you can see on the slide, ang makikita natin dito is that kids imitated the behaviors of the person that they have watched from the show. Ginawa nila yung eksaktong bagay na ginagawa ng tao na napanood nila doon sa TV show. 'Di ba? Kaya kitang-kita nyo dito sa picture, no? Parehong-pareho sila ng ginagawa compared doon sa pinanood nilang TV show. And then if you notice here, Bandura, iniba pa niya yung analysis niya ng mga batang lalaki sa mga batang babae. That's why he had to separate pictures of this, no? Iba yung lalaki, iba yung babae, because originally Bandura hypothesized that aggression will only be modeled or will only be imitated by boys. Bandura was wrong because again, according to the picture, it doesn't matter if you are a boy or a girl. As long as you saw a violent model, you are going to be aggressive. So isa yan sa mga pinakamahalagang findings ni Bandura. Wala sa sex ng bata yan if they are going to be aggressive or not. It all depends on whether they were exposed to a violent model or not. Kaya nga ang isang practical application dito using Bandura study is we need to be careful about what our kids are watching. Kasi marami mga shows ngayon, seemingly innocent, sinasabi nilang pambata, pero kung titignan mo yung dynamics ng mga character in the show, they are very violent. And a lot of these shows are cartoon shows that are seemingly innocent. Hindi na lang ako magsasabi ng mga pangalan ng cartoon shows, but I'm sure you know some of these cartoon shows na although cartoon siya, pero napaka-violente, napaka-aggressive ng mga characters. So let's be careful about letting our kids watch those kinds of shows. And the last method that I want to discuss is called twin studies. Twin studies, madalas itong ginagamit in developmental psychology in examining the contribution of genes and the environment in certain psychological characteristics, di ba? So halimbawa yung tanong mo, yung talino ba ng tao, is that something that you inherit or is that something that you learn from your environment? How about personality? How about religiosity? So kung ganyan yung tanong mo, gusto mong malaman if a variable is something genetics or something environmental, then pwede kang gumamit ng twin studies. Pero mahalaga rin na kapag gagamit ka ng twin study, naiintindihan mo yung pinagkaiba ng monozygotic twins from dizygotic twins. Very quickly, in twin studies, madalas pinag-aaralan yung monozygotic twins. What do you mean by monozygotic twins? These are twins who came from a single egg, a single zygote. Sperm meets the egg, it forms a zygote. Supposedly, yung zygote na yon, isang tao lang yon. But in the case of monozygotic twins, that single zygote further divides into two zygotes, forming two different individuals. At dahil nanggaling sila sa iisang zygote, ang implication niyan, yung mga monozygotic twins, they share 100% of their genes. They are like carbon copies of each other. So, basically, marami na tayong natutunan na mga bagay about certain psychological traits based on our studies on monozygotic twins. Okay? Halimbawa, one good example of this is the idea that aggression, your tendency to be aggressive, meron siyang genetic basis. And how did we know? For example, meron tayong kambal na pinanganak who were reared apart. So these are monozygotic twins. For some reason, they need to be separated at such a young age. Yung isa nasa Pilipinas, habang yung isa ay nasa Amerika. Now, let's say that the baby in the Philippines, pinag-aralan natin yung kanyang genetic makeup and we found out na meron siyang gene, na inherit niya yung gene that makes this baby very aggressive. So this baby is very aggressive in the Philippines. Now, what do you think will happen to his twin who is in America, obviously living in a different environment? Most twin studies will tell you, going back to the slide, na kahit na they are reared apart, they will share or they will express the same psychological characteristic, which is magiging pareho silang aggressive. Aggressive yung baby sa Pilipinas, aggressive din yung kakambal niya sa Amerika, which tells you na meron talagang genetic basis yung pagiging aggressive ng tao. Minsan namamanay yung tendency to be aggressive within our genetic inheritance from our parents. Another example is mathematical giftedness. Yung galing ba sa math, meron ba yung genetic basis or is it purely from the environment? Studies after studies have shown that math ability seems to have a genetic basis. Paano nating malaman? Again, going back to monozygotic twins who were reared apart. Yung isa lumaki sa Amerika, let's say yung isa lumaki sa Pilipinas. Yung lumaki sa Pilipinas magaling sa math. Okay? Yung lumaki sa Amerika, kahit na hindi pa sila nagkita ng kambal niya, guess what? Magaling din sa math. So that is one strong evidence that your ability to solve mathematical problems may have a genetic basis. One last example, ito very interesting. Meron bang genetic basis yung pet preference? Yung hilig mo sa isang hayop, is that something genetics, no? Again, going back to monozygotic twins, imagine may kambal na naghiwalay. Yung isang kambal ay lumaki sa Pilipinas, yung isang kambal lumaki sa Amerika. Now, habang lumalaki yung kambal sa yung twin sa Pilipinas, napansin ng mga magulang niya that this person loves pets. He loves pets. Now, the thing is, yung kanyang kambal na nasa Amerika, kahit na hindi pa sila nagkita, even if they are living in a different environment, guess what? That person also loves pet. Again, they did not communicate, hindi sila nagkita ever in their lives, but yet, they both love pets. What does that tell you? It seems like pet preference, meron siyang genetic basis. Okay, so again, yun yung mga tanong na, o yun yung mga ideas and mga discoveries na natutunan natin because of twin studies. Merong sinasabing isang quote, itong psychologist na ito, sabi niya, in some domains, it looks as though our identical twins reared apart are just as similar as identical twins reared together. Now, that's an amazing finding, and I can assure you, none of us would have expected that degree of similarity. Ang sinasabi lang ng psychologist na ito is, it is very surprising talaga. Nakaka-amaze talaga yung mga findings that there are certain psychological characteristics na namamana pala natin genetically. And we are able to confirm that idea na may mga kaugalian tayong namamana natin genetically through using twin studies. Okay? So, there you go. Those are the 4 other research methods na pwede nyong gamitin given your research question that you will formulate towards the end of the term. Meron tayong correlation research, cross-sectional research / longitudinal research, experimental research, and twin studies. So, in the future, kapag naka-formulate na kayo ng tanong in this subject, marami na kayong pagpipilian, no? So, from my first lecture video hanggang dito sa lecture video na ito, there are a lot of psychological research methods that you can consider depending on the research question that you want to answer in your final project. Okay? So, all in all, meron tayong 9 different research methods. So, ito yung naging coverage ko sa part 1 of my video and part 2 of my video. So, with this, abangan nyo yung inyong post-lecture task in our Animo space, and I will see you in the next module where I'm going to upload a new video on methods of psychological research. Thank you for listening, and you have a great night. God bless.